Opening the center creates immediate opportunities for piece development and control. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling, setting up a dynamic early game. Developing this knight aims to control central squares and prepare for kingside castling, keeping options open for white's pawn structure. Asserting central presence solidifies black's influence, preparing to contest the d4 pawn and potentially launch a queenside initiative. Challenging black's central control, white aggressively disputes the d5 pawn, aiming for queenside expansion and potentially opening lines. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop the king's bishop while accepting a slight structural challenge. Reinforcing the central pawn structure, white solidifies their grip on the e4 square and prepares for further development without immediate tactical fireworks. Solidifying the pawn chain creates a robust defensive structure, preparing for a gradual queenside build-up. Solidifying the center's pawn chain allows for gradual development and prepares to challenge black's central grip. Developing the knight to d7 bolsters the central pawn chain, preparing for a flexible pawn break while keeping the bishop on c8 free to join the fray. Unveiling the queen to c2 solidifies control over the central squares and prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously maintaining a vigilant watch over the d-file. Unlocking a key diagonal for the bishop and preparing for castling. This placement subtly aims to reinforce the central pawn structure while offering a flexible piece for potential counterplay, even if it momentarily obstructs the d-pawn's advance. Developing the bishop to d3 initiates a classic development sequence, aiming to castle kingside swiftly and prepare for potential central pawn breaks like e4. The bishop's placement supports the d4 pawn and eyes the queenside, while also contributing to a cohesive pawn structure before launching any aggressive plans. Securing the king behind a pawn shield is a prudent step, consolidating the position after developing all minor pieces, though it allows white a slight lead in center occupation, hinting at potential central pawn breaks later. Castling secures the monarch, preparing to shift focus towards the center and potentially open lines for future kingside activity. A prudent step to consolidate before initiating further pawn advances or piece exchanges. Embracing central control, black surrenders the pawn for a freer position, opening lines for potential counterplay and developing pieces harmoniously. This pawn recapture, while seemingly direct, initiates a strategic dance where black aims to exploit the slight tempo gain and create active piece play rather than clinging rigidly to pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn re-establishes symmetry, but observe how the white bishop now eyes the queenside and potentially the vulnerable black king. Should the center open, securing queenside space and preparing for b5 pawn thrusts to challenge white's central control becomes paramount now. Clearing the queenside path for the rook. This push initiates a subtle struggle for queenside space in the a-file, potentially disrupting black's planned development or forcing a reaction before initiating a central pawn advance. Challenging the center with such a pawn thrust immediately reopens lines that black had previously closed off, creating dynamic imbalances where piece activity could become more important than pawn structure. Opening the central file for immediate influence. White prioritizes activating the rook on its most advantageous avenue, preparing for potential future operations against black's queenside or even a direct challenge on the d-file should opportunities arise. Positioning the queen centrally aims to both defend the d5 pawn and prepare for potential advances on the queenside, while also keeping an eye on the weakened kingside. Unleashing the knight to e4 spearheads a daring maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch. This aggressive redeployment hints at a desire to seize central initiative, pushing black to either defend passively or engage in tactical exchanges that might favor white's more active piece play. Observe how this knight now eyes vulnerable squares and prepares for further complications. Exchanging the knight on e4 immediately alleviates some of black's cramped queenside and frees the d-pawn, setting the stage for a potential cxd4 sequence to challenge white's central pawn mass. Capturing the pawn with the queen immediately escalates the confrontation, directly challenging black's central pawn structure and opening up lines for white's rooks. This exchange, while materializing equality on the board, significantly alters the positional landscape, creating dynamic possibilities and demanding precise calculation from both sides, as black must now decide how to address the newly exposed weaknesses and potential diagonal threats. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for potential pawn structure shifts. This maneuver gracefully repositions the knight to a more active diagonal. Harnessing the queen's reach across the board, white aims to disrupt black's nascent kingside coordination and exploit the potential weaknesses around the black monarch. Strategically, this maneuver introduces an immediate threat to the h7 pawn, forcing black to consider defensive adjustments rather than continuing with their planned development. The repositioning of the queen to a more active square creates an interesting geometrical tension, potentially pinning pieces or forcing valuable tempo loss for black. Consider how this aggressive queen placement might influence the long-term control of the dark squares and the safety of the black king as the game progresses. By placing the queen on h4, white is essentially asking black to commit to a defensive plan, potentially revealing their intentions and creating exploitable vulnerabilities. This move injects immediate dynamism into the position, shifting the focus from positional maneuvering to a more tactical struggle, demanding precise calculation from both sides. The queen's journey to the kingside suggests white is preparing for an assault, potentially seeking to exploit the fact that black's kingside pieces are not yet fully mobilized. For defense, observe the altered pawn structure and piece interplay. This queen sortie could unlock lines of attack that were previously inaccessible. Clearing the central diagonal creates an immediate tactical opportunity for black, potentially opening lines towards white's king. This exchange disrupts white's pawn structure and invites black's knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares that will inevitably arise after the recapture. Consider how this captures will simplify the position and potentially lead to a more dynamic middle game, where precise piece play will be paramount. Unlocking the d-file for the rook after black's pawn sacrifice creates immediate attacking potential, but carefully eyeing that knight on f6 as it's currently without immediate pawn support is crucial for future exchanges. A clever attempt to gain breathing room for the king, preventing any immediate ideas of bh7 or g4 gram5 advances down the kingside. However, it creates a slight weakness on the dark squares around the monarch and sacrifices a tempo that could have been used to develop the remaining pieces or consolidate the pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn thrust aims to shatter the pawn chain and open diagonals for the queen and bishop. Sensing the central pressure, the knight elegantly retreats to a square where it can both defend the e-pawn and survey the kingside, preparing for a potential pawn push or even a daring knight sortie to the kingside should the opportunity arise. Unleashing a dramatic sacrificial attack, white gambles on opening lines towards the black king, hoping to overwhelm black's defenses before they can consolidate their material advantage. This audacious push transforms the battlefield, forcing black to navigate a complex tactical minefield where every piece must be precisely positioned to parry the immediate threats. The success of this aggressive sortie hinges entirely on white's ability to generate decisive follow-up attacks and black's capacity to absorb the pressure and find defensive resources. Opening the floodgates to your king's defense with this pawn capture exposes a critical weakness. The once fortified structure now presents inviting avenues for white's attacking pieces, particularly the queen, to penetrate the weakened kingside. This decision sacrifices structural integrity for temporary material gain, a trade-off that often proves perilous when the opponent boasts active pieces poised for swift exploitation. The unleashed diagonal promises further complications, and vigilance will be paramount as white seeks to capitalize on this immediate king safety deficit. Re-establishing pressure on the c-file is paramount, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure black has created. A daring gambit has just been accepted, and now black must navigate the consequences of relinquishing the c5 square. This retreat of the queen, though seemingly passive, aims to regroup and assess the looming threats emanating from white's bishop pair and the newly opened d-file. The long-term health of the king is now a primary concern, as white's pieces are beginning to converge with alarming speed. The queen's audacity at h6, a breathtaking gamble, plunges into the heart of black's defense, seeking to exploit the king's exposed position and the disrupted pawn shield. This aggressive thrust, though superficially dazzling, requires precise follow-through. A miscalculation could leave the white queen stranded and vulnerable, or worse, allow black to consolidate and launch a devastating counterattack. The immediate question is whether white can convert this aggressive initiative into a tangible advantage, or if this bold maneuver is merely a theatrical flourish that dissipates under closer inspection, leaving black with valuable time to reorganize their forces. The open files and the weakened dark squares around the black king now become the focal points of this exciting, yet perilous, tactical skirmish. Abandoning the defense of the king entirely, black ignites a desperate counterattack, seeking to exploit white's exposed monarch through a swift pawn thrust aimed at disruption and potentially creating mating nets. Sacrificing the queen to simplify into a favorable endgame, white aims to exploit black's exposed king and potentially create passed pawns. Navigating the newly opened files, black reclaims central influence and repositions the knight for potential action on the kingside, sensing a shift toward a more tactical middle game where piece activity will prove paramount. Seizing central space, this pawn lunges forward, creating an immediate outpost and forcing the knight to reroute, disrupting black's defensive structure. Seeking to activate the bishop and contest the central light squares, black repositions their prelate to a more dynamic diagonal, anticipating potential pawn advances and aiming to undermine white's central control. Unleashing the pawn, white immediately seizes the crucial e-file, promising to disrupt black's king's sanctuary and create immediate threats. This aggressive pawn thrust signals a clear intent to exploit the awkward placement of black's pieces, particularly the pinned knight on f6 and the vulnerable king. The resulting pawn chain, extending into black's territory, will restrict black's mobility and potentially lead to a swift tactical confrontation, forcing black to defend diligently. With the exchange of queens, the game transitions into a more strategic battle, and bxf6 is a necessary step to reintegrate the bishop into the defensive structure after white's pawn capture. This development repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially offering defensive support or preparing for future counterplay. Observe how the pawn structure has been altered. Black's king now has an extra pawn shield, but this comes at the cost of reduced piece mobility in certain areas. The focus shifts to controlling the remaining open files and developing a cohesive plan for the middle game, as any misplaced piece could be exploited. Reclaiming the central diagonal. Bishop to e4 aims to activate a piece that has been somewhat passive since the early exchanges. Now eyeing the d5 square and potentially supporting a future pawn push or piece maneuver. Clearing the path for the rook to activate on the d-file. This maneuver aims to redistribute Black's forces, seeking greater activity and potentially challenging White's central pawn structure. Stepping into the pawn storm. g4 seeks to create defensive chaos around Black's monarch, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares after the pawn exchanges and potentially open lines for attack. Consolidating forces on the queenside. Black repositions the rook to the b-file, a proactive step to challenge White's growing influence in that sector and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece maneuvering. Asserting dominance on the kingside. This pawn thrust aims to dislodge Black's knight from its defensive perch on f6, opening lines for White's remaining minor pieces and potentially creating weaknesses around the Black king. A bold repositioning of the bishop, seeking refuge on the queenside and potentially eyeing the now exposed kingside dark squares. Gaining an open file is the priority here, and the knight's repositioning prepares to contest the newly opened central diagonal. Bringing the bishop back to the c8h3 diagonal offers a more active defensive posture and prepares to contest the crucial e-file, potentially preventing White's doubled pawns from advancing further down the board. Prying open the queenside further creates attacking avenues, aiming to exploit the weakened structure after Black's pawn push. Reclaiming the a-file's control. The bishop immediately targets the central pawn structure and eyes the knight's insecure perch, creating active counterplay. Reclaiming the d-file with the rook. White aims to establish a powerful battery against Black's seemingly passive position, threatening to exploit any weaknesses that arise from the pawn structure. Black finally breaks open the center, a desperate attempt to inject some life into the position and disrupt White's growing space. Advantage. Unleashing the rook deep into enemy territory creates a fascinating positional dilemma. White hopes to exploit Black's slightly uncoordinated pieces by forcing concrete concessions or opening lines, but must be wary of the immediate tactical threats that arise from such aggressive placement, especially with the kingside still somewhat exposed. The bishop's repositioning to b5 aggressively probes the queenside, eyeing the central squares and aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure. A subtle yet potent maneuver to regain initiative after a period of defensive maneuvering. The exchange sacrifice on d8 definitively simplifies the position, stripping away the last of the queens and initiating a transition into a simplified endgame where White aims to leverage their advanced pawn majority on the queenside. Reclaiming the rook from the open file provides an immediate reprieve from White's persistent pressure, allowing Black to begin regrouping its scattered forces and potentially activating its rook for future counterplay. The knight's repositioning to f3 aims to initiate a regrouping, potentially preparing to swing over to the kingside and participate in a kingside attack or bolster. Central control. It's a flexible move that acknowledges White's pawn advances on the kingside don't have immediate concrete threats but builds potential. Snatching that pawn on b2 reveals a bold disregard for positional integrity, prioritizing immediate material gain over harmonious development, and potentially isolating the rook on a8 if White manages to secure the d-file. Unleashing the rook to the 7th rank immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and aims to exploit the exposed king, creating immediate tactical possibilities. The rook now eyes the vulnerable white king, aiming to exploit the open file and potential weaknesses created by the pawn structure. Seizing the open file, white aggressively challenges black's pawns and aims to exploit the weakened queenside structure. A desperado sacrifice attempting to disrupt white's centralized rook and potentially create counterplay. The king embarks on a perilous journey across the open battlefield, seeking refuge behind what remains of his pawn shield after a period of aggressive skirmishing. Unlocking a path for the rook. This placement aims to activate the piece towards the queenside, eyeing potential breakthroughs or support for pawn advances, while simultaneously seeking to improve its position relative to white's active knight. A strategic retreat. This allows the king a vital escape square, shifting focus to reinforcing the rook's position along the 3rd rank. Unleashing the rook to the critical 1st rank immediately challenges white's pawn chain and opens up lines of attack towards the monarch. The knight's journey to d4 unlocks the d-file and sets a trap for the black bishop, potentially forcing a material advantage if the bishop retreats carelessly. Unleashing a desperate check. The bishop attempts to disrupt white's encroaching pieces and perhaps scramble for counterplay on the open files. A last-ditch effort to find sanctuary for the king amidst the consolidating opponent. A quiet repositioning. This bishop retreat to g2 aims to shore up the king's defenses and prepare for potential counterplay along the now open g-file, while simultaneously offering a defensive shield against any immediate threats from black's bishop. On a3. The black king finds itself under intense scrutiny as the rook swings over to join the attack on the open c-file, amplifying the pressure on white's already compromised defenses. Unlocking the king's diagonal defense. This subtle pawn advance aims to liberate the knight and potentially create a backdoor escape route for the king. The bishop's retreat to d3, eyeing the pawn on a5, aims to disrupt white's recent gains and potentially redeploy to a more active square, perhaps supporting a future kingside push or even preparing a clever deflection sacrifice. Shifting the rook to the 3rd rank shores up the pawn structure on the queenside while preparing to contest the critical 3rd file. Seizing the open file with the rook fundamentally alters the dynamic, offering a lifeline and creating immediate counterplay against white's slightly misplaced pieces. And uncastled king. Securing the pawn after its capture finally stabilizes the material balance. But the immediate prospect is a rapid descent into an endgame where black's bishop pair will become a significant advantage. The bishop's repositioning onto the 4th rank opens a precarious diagonal, potentially targeting white's vulnerable pawns on the queenside and threatening to disrupt any coordinated defense white might attempt to establish. Unlocking the h-file's potential becomes paramount, forcing black to constantly re-evaluate their defensive structure. Reclaiming the open file with the bishop offers a crucial tempo, forcing white to address its new influence and potentially disrupting their pawn chain's integrity. On the kingside, the knight's repositioning to d4 finally capitalizes on the open files and creates a powerful central presence, potentially aiming to support a pawn advance or join a kingside attack. Black retrieves the pawn, aiming to simplify the position. But this neglects white's immediate knight activity on d4, which can now exploit the open files and the weakened kingside structure. Pawns advance, opening new avenues for the queen and potentially creating a passed pawn on the f-file. A significant threat in this endgame. The bishop's retreat to c3 repositions the piece to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's advancing pawn formation and potentially create threats against the king's defenses. Cleverly repositions the knight to a more aggressive outpost, eyeing black's vulnerable pawns and preparing to support a potential pawn push on the kingside, while simultaneously restricting the opposing bishop's scope. The black pawn bravely advances, seeking to disrupt white's solidified pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. Securing the advanced knight with this capture immediately sharpens the positional battle, as its presence on the a5 square now directly challenges black's pawn structure on the queenside and restricts defensive maneuverability. The bishop sacrifices its life to create a passed pawn, hoping to draw the knight away from its crucial defensive post, finally bringing the bishop to bear. White repositions its most active piece to a square where it exerts maximum influence over black's vulnerable pawns and potential mating threats. The bishop retreats, creating a fortress-like structure on the queenside by blocking white's advancing pawns and simultaneously protecting the precious kingside knight, solidifying the pawn chain's protection and preparing to advance. The bishop reassumes its guarding role on a square that prevents further incursions by the enemy knight while also eyeing the weakened kingside. Black's intention to reinforce the a5 outpost with the bishop highlights the ongoing struggle for central influence and potential pawn breaks. Unlocking the diagonal pressure against the black king by advancing the f-pawn creates immediate threats of mate or significant material gain, forcing black to react defensively to a newly opened avenue of attack. The bishop's retreat to f4 is an attempt to preserve its activity, but it allows white's pawns to push forward more aggressively. Clearing a path for the king to activate into the center is the priority now. Sacrificing the bishop to clear the path for the advancing pawns, a desperate gamble to activate the king's defense and create counterplay. Unleashing a pawn storm, white advances its g-pawn, aiming to pry open the king's defenses with a determined march towards the enemy monarch, threatening a swift, decisive breakthrough that black must carefully neutralize. A bold attempt to seize the initiative and disrupt white's well-placed pawns, though it potentially opens lines towards your own king. The king now marches into the fray, aiming to support the advanced pawns and potentially corner black's pieces. The king suddenly finds himself in the spotlight, seeking refuge as the bishop uncovers an attack along the diagonal. Securing your monarch in this exposed position is paramount, preventing any immediate threats from black's bishop and knight coordination. Unleashing a final check to disrupt white's encroaching king, black sacrifices tempo to avoid an immediate pawn promotion and exploit the diagonal vulnerability now exposed on the king's path. The king ventures into open territory, a risky but potentially decisive maneuver to support the pawn's advance towards promotion. Securing the bishop's retreat from the encroaching pawn and solidifying its central presence. This maneuver prepares for potential kingside action or a strategic regrouping in the face of white's pawn storm. Seeking to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop, white attempts to consolidate his position and limit black's counterplay. The pawn's advance now opens a path for the bishop to potentially become a powerful attacking piece. The bishop's capture on g6 finally resolves the pawn structure, opening a path for the white king to become more active while simultaneously threatening the black king's remaining defenders. A desperate king, exposed on the kingside, now seeks refuge, but the checking bishop aims to trap it. The monarch steps forward, a bold but potentially perilous advance, seeking to escape the clutches of the opposing bishop and find sanctuary behind its own pawns. A gamble on regaining some lost pawn structure and central influence. seizing upon the open diagonal for a potential future pawn push. Black aims to consolidate their advantage and prepare for an active endgame.